Hello, hello. Welcome back to Peak Northwest, an outdoors and travel podcast by the Oregonian and Oregon Live, dedicated to the adventure and exploration of our beautiful Pacific Northwest. I'm Jamie Hale.
And I'm Kiara Profena. Together we take you to some of the most beautiful and interesting destinations in our region, discussing where to go, what to do, and places to see. And today we're heading back in time to 1805.
1805. That's when the Lewis and Clark expedition was making its way across the continent to explore lands acquired in the Louisiana Purchase and to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. After more than a year on the trail, the core of discovery finally reached what is now the Pacific Northwest.
And it's a bit of an interesting story with a couple of twists and some lore. So here to tell us a bit more about that is Jill Harding, Visitor Services Program Manager at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. Jill, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Yeah, well, I feel like the Lewis and Clark journey is so storied, and it's truly this continent-wide story, this history, this experience they had. But I feel like those of us in the Northwest here are particularly interested in their time they spent over here in this corner of the continent, right? So where do we start here? I guess maybe with like what happened when that Lewis and Clark reached the end of their journey here in the Northwest.
Okay, so when they're coming down the Columbia River, and they actually on November 8th think that they saw the expedition, or they saw the ocean, and they weren't. They were seeing the estuary of the Columbia River. They were hoping to see a boat when they got out here to maybe resupply themselves, but unfortunately they weren't here during the same time as when the ships came in, because they got here in the winter time. And so things get pretty rough out here on the Columbia and on the Pacific Ocean. So they're making their way down the Columbia River, and there just are storms out here on the coast come in from the south-southwest starting in late October, November, and they were just getting hammered, and waves throwing up on them, trees falling down, and they're on what today is the Washington side of the Columbia River, and pretty high cliffs over on that side, if you've ever been over there. And so they're hiding in these little niches and kind of trying to protect themselves from the storms. And literally there's rocks rolling down the hills. Trees are floating in the river, and basically logs being thrown up on them as they're trying to cling to the shore, protecting the waves. Eventually, they're able to make it around the point, which is called Meriwether Point today, which is where the big bridge goes across from Astoria to Washington. And they talk about being in those niches, and they call them, it was a dismal niche of where they stayed. And then they make it around. And so much like when we have our storms out here, right after we have the storms, we have the kind of this nice weather, and it kind of gets a little cold. And so they make it to actually a sandy beach, because the jetties weren't here. So on the Washington side, right after you cross the bridge, the Astoria-Meriwether Bridge, that was actually all a sandy beach, like an ocean beach, because the sand from the jetties that now block the jetties, all that sand was on that beach over there. And they saw a village, but no one was in the village. So they thought it was abandoned, but they made themselves a home. And then they asked everyone on the expedition, because it was getting a little colder, and they figured they're going to have to spend the winter someplace. And so they asked everyone, where do you want to spend the winter? And this was really unusual, because this was a military expedition, and the captains always had the final say. But what was so great about this expedition is the captains really listened to their people. And that's one of their strengths of their leadership. And they asked, okay, where do you guys want to stay? And everyone had a voice, which was another unusual thing, because you had Sacagawea, who was a woman, and Native American. She was a Shawnee. So she was able to give her voice. And then there was also York, who was Clark's enslaved man, and they asked him his opinion. So, two very unusual things. And the majority said, hey, let's go check out the south side. Because by then, the Clatsops, who live over in their homeland, is what today is Astoria, they were paddling across and saying, hey, come on over. We got a great place to live over there. And so the majority said, hey, let's go check out that side. The village they were staying at is what today we call Middle Village. And it's a Chinookan village. And a lot of trading and commerce happened when the trade ships would come in. But once again, it was wintertime. And the Chinookan and Clatsop people have summer homes and winter homes. And the Chinook were smart enough not to be living down on the Columbia River when the big storms come on. So most of the Chinookan people were up around Willapa Bay in their winter homes. So the expedition, actually to cross the Columbia, they had to go back up the Columbia River to basically the east end of what is today Astoria, crossover. They checked out what today is Astoria, but anywhere you see anything flat around the town of Astoria wasn't there. That's all filled. So Lewis and Clark are like, not a good campsite. And then they headed up the river, which was what called the Nuttall River, but today it's the Lewis and Clark River. And where they built their fort today, or where they built the fort, was basically the first hill up out of the wetlands. And Clark wrote that they found a spot that was 30 feet above high tide, well timbered. So that was, then they continued to spend 106 days here. While they were here, they went down to what today is Seaside, made salt to help preserve meat for the return trip. They made clothing for the return trip. Lewis and Clark were heavily writing in their journals, getting caught up on things. And then after 106 days, they turned around and went home. So that's kind of the nutshell of their stay here. And being a ranger down at the fort, when I talk to visitors, I always like to see what questions they have about.
Well, you mentioned, the storms coming in, and those of us who have lived in Northwest, I mean, maybe this year's not a great example, but often, I mean, it used to be too, like, October to May, I feel like you have to expect there to be some pretty consistent rain. And my understanding is it rained pretty much the entire time that Lewis and Clark were here.
Yeah, there's a really good quote that we like to use, and it's from Sergeant Gass. And he said that they were here 106 days, and it rained every day except 12. And of the 12, they saw the sun 6.
It's so relatable.
Yeah. And it wasn't really quite that bad, because he's actually writing it in April after they actually left. So he's reflecting back. And if you actually go through the journals, the expedition kept actually a weather log. That was one of their directives from President Jefferson. President Jefferson wrote like a 4-page, what we call the letter of instruction of everything they were supposed to do. And one was to keep track of the weather. And while they were here, they wrote down every day, basically looked out, see what the weather was. They had a thermometer, but it had already broken. So they were just like, hey, it rained, not rain. And it is really fun looking at the logs, because you will see that they're doing like little initials. So R for rain, A for after, C for clouds, F for fair. So you'll get a lot of FAR, fair after rain. But the fun ones are when you see like FARAC, snow, lightning, sun, fair. And it's all in one day. And you're like, yep, that's kind of what it's like. We are a temperate rainforest out here. We get about 100 inches of rain on here at the coast yearly. So 70 to 100 is usually our average. So we get a lot of, it's wet. And we do get the storms. The December 16th, the expedition, and so they're building their fort and they're living in the woods in what's left of their tents as they're building the fort. And December 16th, the storm comes in. And Clark writes that trees are literally being twisted and thrown off. And a lot of people, I'm not old enough for the Columbus Day storm, but I have family that talk about the Columbus Day storm. Mm-hmm. I talk about the 2000, I think they call it the 2000 gale, and when we had multiple storms come in. And yeah, you can still walk through the fort or through the park today and see remnants of the 2000 storm, and with trees that have been, twisted off or totally knocked over. So I like to tell visitors that come here and don't know about our weather out here, we don't have hurricanes, but we get hurricane force winds. And people are usually pretty surprised of how high our winds get out here on the coast.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it was a very dramatic winter that year that they were here, would you say?
Mm-hmm. it was. They weren't prepared for it. A lot of times in the journals, the other great quote they always do is they write, rained as usual. But we like to say, if it wasn't for the rain, then the captains wouldn't have been stuck in the fort, in their quarters, getting caught up on their journals. So in the journals, you'll see a lot of writing about the plants and the animals and the people they met out on the plains. And so they're elaborating more of it. So they're getting caught up on their homework while they were here. Mm-hmm. So if it wasn't for the rain, we wouldn't know as much as what we do today of what the United States looked like back then.
So they get the fort up. They make it through the storm. They get their fort built, Fort Clatsop. What is life like for them inside of these winter quarters?
It's they're busy. One of the first things that the captains do is establish their military routine. So drilling, guard duty, keeping all the soldiers really focused, so they didn't realize how miserable they were. A lot of hunting. They're constantly going out and getting food. It took an elk and a deer a day to feed this crew. You're talking 33 people. One of the persons, of course, is the baby, Jean-Baptiste. He had his first birthday here. And 34, if you count the dog. And you have to count the dog because he was 150-pound Newfoundland, so he's a big dog.
Gosh.
And so an elk and a deer a day to feed this crew. And that's just a day. Of course, there was no fruits and vegetables. They're here in the wintertime, so there's no berries. They are doing trading with the Clatsops for dried pounded berries, but they're also they don't have much trade items left. By the time they leave the fort, they only have 2 handkerchiefs full of trade items, and they still have to get all the way home. So they're pretty light on their trade items. And so they're buying what they can to help supplement. And everyone always asks, well, how come they didn't eat salmon? So let me ask you, why didn't they eat salmon while they were here?
I mean, either it wasn't the right season for salmon, or they didn't know how to catch salmon, or they didn't think ahead and catch salmon and dry salmon to save for the winter.
Yeah, it wasn't the season. There was no salmon runs. So they did, once again, trade for salmon with Clatsop and the Chinookan people. But, hey, that was their food and their store for the winter, so they weren't really trading much of that. So, plus, you can't make clothing out of salmon. So, salmon skin doesn't really work. So, that's the other thing they were doing, was making clothing. Any of their military uniforms that they started with, they basically have been wearing for about 2 years now. They've been on the trail for 2 years. And so, clothing was just falling off of them. So they're tanning hides, making shirts, clothes. They made 338 pairs of moccasins, so 338 pairs of shoes just to get stocked up for their return trip while they were here. They also went down to what is today Seaside, collected seawater, boiled it to get salt, and that was to preserve their meat. So in that day and age, to preserve meat, you would have a barrel, and then you'd put salt in it, put a slab of meat, salt, meat, and fill the barrel all the way up. And then you'd fill the barrel with water. And basically, you're kind of pickling the meat, but that was a common way to preserve meat back then, especially for travel. And so that's why the expedition wanted the salt, was to help get up a supply of store food for the return trip.
So while they were here, they were stocking up, getting ready for their return, and they were originally supposed to stay until April, but they ended up leaving in March. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Their original
So
plan was to stay until April. They left on March 23rd. They left for one big main reason is the elk around here got smart, and they're like, we're leaving. So the elk started getting further and further away. But why? Because while they were here, they shot something like 131 elk.
Oh my God.
So the elk herds started moving, and the elk herds around here do naturally migrate and move around. But yeah, I always like to say the ones that you see here on the coast are descendants from the smart ones that got away from the expedition. And as you're driving around, we still have elk herds today that you can check out, and they're the descendants of the ones that the expedition saw. So the main reason, and the second reason, was the weather started getting a little better, and so they're like, "Hey, we're out of here. We're tired of the rain. It's not quite raining as much. Maybe we should start heading east." Because they left early, when they got to what today's Idaho, they had to wait for a month for the Rocky Mountains to clear. And they were hanging out with the Nez Perce people, and they kept asking the Nez Perce, "Hey, when can we get over those mountains, get over the Rockies?" And the Nez Perce said, "As soon as the salmon return." And of course, you could see Lewis and Clark going, "What? You're waiting for the salmon?" But scientifically, if you think about it, once the snow starts melting and the rivers are getting fuller, that's when our salmon start coming up for their spring and summer runs, because all that water is filling up those rivers. So, and sure enough, the salmon started coming back, and the Rocky Mountains cleared, and the expedition could get back over and headed home.
I don't know if this is quite the narrative, but when I hear this story, what it sounds like to me is you have the Lewis and Clark expedition reaching the Northwest, being woefully unprepared for the winter, ending up in a situation where they end up hungry, miserable from the weather. I'm guessing probably some lice or other kinds of things like that, and going like, we cannot wait until April. It's kind of relatable because this time of year, once it gets end of February, beginning of March, you're like, is it really going to keep raining? Is this it? And so it's really relatable if they'd be like, no, we're going to get out of here. The fact that they escaped the rain only to get stuck in the snow, to me, is classic. You got to wait. You need some patience in this.
Yeah.
But was this, I don't know, is that, am I reading that right, or am I reading into this?
No, I think they were tired of being here. They do talk about preferring the cold winters of North Dakota. That was where they spent their first winter on the trail, in what today's North Dakota, with the Mandan people. They built Fort Mandan out there, and it was cold, but as they say, it's a dry cold. I prefer the rain. I grew up in Washington, lived in Oregon. I had anything east of the Cascades and I start drying out way too much. But everyone, they talk about the cold. And the expedition talked about when they were out hunting in North Dakota, they shot an elk or a buffalo and they could leave it out there overnight and it would freeze. When they shot an elk here, because a couple of guys would go out hunting, they would shoot an elk. Two guys can't bring in multiple elk, so they bring in what they could, send folks out the next day to retrieve it. Well, it would start, of course, rotting and spoiling. So they always talk about the elk meat being spoiled because it would start rotting before they could get it in. And they also talked about it being poor elk meat. So the elk didn't have a lot of fat on them. So it was, they weren't getting that nice piece of steak that was nicely marbled because it was a winter elk. So yeah, they do talk about wanting that they would have preferred North Dakota's weather than ours. And I think people forget sometimes of how much it rains here. And I always call it that bone chilling, that cold that creeps in and just gets into your bone. Like I said, I happen to like it.
It is the sort of classic like East Coast transplant coming out to the Northwest and complaining about how rainy it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And yeah, they also, it's also the clouds. Even if it's not raining, it seems like you have this cloud and it gets pretty gray around here. And I think the expedition, some historians say that they had the seasonal, what is that? The seasonal immune.
Seasonal affective disorder, I think.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. They needed their vitamin D.
Yeah. So they were ready to leave. They were also getting homesick. I mean, they've been on the trail, 2 years, and Lewis writes in his journal on New Year's that in a year's time they should be in the bosoms of our family and friends, and he was really looking forward to that. So they are pretty homesick, and as they're leaving, going up the Columbia River, the other thing is there was a lot of people out here. We don't realize it, but there was because of the Columbia River with the salmon, there were a lot of nations. I mean, you had the Clatsop and the Chinook, the Wakayakum, the Cathlamet, the Willapa all out here on the coast. You had the Clatskanie. I mean, and then as you're going up the river around Portland, you have the Multnomah. And then you get through the gorge, you have the Cayuse, and as far as, so actually a lot of people, when they came across what today's, Montana, they didn't see anyone. Now, the Crow probably saw them, or the Blackfeet probably saw them, but they didn't meet anybody going all the way across Montana. Then they're coming down the Columbia River and they're meeting people after people after people all along the river. So Lewis, he's an introvert, and you can see in the journals on the way home, he's getting tired of meeting people. And he talks about the international greeting. So I guess the folks on the Columbia River would often greet you with a hug. And him being an introvert, it didn't work well for him. He was getting he gets a little testy in his journals. You can see he's not on his best diplomatic behavior sometimes going home.
Came down to Portland and everyone wants to hug.
It's too cold.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's a lot going on there. And so when they were finally getting out of the Pacific Northwest, they decided to leave. There's a story about a stolen canoe. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Tell us more about what happened there.
Okay, so you got to understand their canoe situation. So when they get to heading west, heading out here, they get over the Rocky Mountains. They have horses. That with the help of Sacagawea and her husband Toussaint, they get horses to get across the Rocky Mountains, and they're staying with the Nez Perce. and they make 5 canoes in 10 days. And those are great canoes for coming down the Columbia River and going through all the rapids because they're big, they're heavy, they can bounce off those rocks and make it through. And those, if you, the indigenous people on the east side of the Cascades had canoes like that. Well, when you get out here to the mouth of the Columbia River, the canoes need to be a little different. You need a high prow so it can cut through those big ocean waves. And as they get their canoes down here, they're having a hard time with the waves out here. But they get to, when they build Fort Clatsop, they have their canoes. They are on their way down. They actually end up picking up what they call a small Native American canoe, and they bought that one, and they're using it while they're down here. They're also not used to our tides because they record that we have 9 to 10 foot tides, which is true. That's what we still have today. And they talk about having their canoes and then going down to check on them, and they're gone because the tide took them away. They didn't tie them down. So they lost a couple of canoes that way. And they also need more canoes to go home. So they do buy one, and Lewis is a little bit upset about the price of the canoe that they buy. They gave a carat of tobacco, which is basically a plant of tobacco, all the leaves. That's a carat. And then his military uniform. So the Clatsop and Chinookan canoes take about a year to make. They're beautiful canoes. They're made out of cedar. They're very thin. They're very light. They handle like a dream. They cut through the water. So they're just these beautiful canoes. Like I said, they take about a year to make. And usually the only time the Clatsops give away a canoe is like for a wedding for a family that's just starting out. And these canoes, even today, are part of the family. So they're a living canoe. But Lewis and Clark are getting desperate. The expedition's getting desperate, and they really need a canoe. So they buy one, but they really need another canoe to help get them home. And they do end up stealing one. The canoe is actually from a person who was Wakayakum, so a little bit farther up the river. He comes down, he's trading, and then, he parks his canoe, and then he comes out and his canoe's gone. And it's kind of like, hey, unfortunately, hey, I went to Fred Meyer and then walked out and my car is no longer there. So,
yeah.
So Lewis and Clark, they're not, they're desperate. That's not an excuse. They're desperate. And they know, because when the Ta'i of the leader of the Clatsops, who they've been trading with, go away, when he comes over, they kind of hide the canoe, even though it's not his, but word gets around. So they kind of hide the canoe. And the really funny thing is as the expedition's leaving, maybe it's not funny, ironic, as the expedition leaving, they're heading up the river, and they're just east of Astoria in the Napa area and Brownsmead area. And there's a bunch of islands and channels. And so the expedition they get in the wrong channel. And there's some Clatsop and some Chinookan people, and they're like, hey, you're in the wrong channel. You want to come over this way? And so, the expedition's like, oh, okay. And they paddle over that way. And one of the guys in the canoe of the Clatsops is the Wakayakum guy. And he goes, I know that canoe. So they're like, oh. Oops. So anyway, the expedition give the Wakayakum gentleman a bunch of elk hide in payment for his canoe. So you can decide whether that was a good trade, not a good trade. I don't know. There has been also in the recent years, since the Lewis and Clark 200th bicentennial commemoration, there has been a couple of different reparations. So the Chinookan people were some very nice donors, um, gave them the ability to make another canoe and was given a canoe. And then the Clatsops also were given a canoe also. Well, the canoe was built for them, but, was given the money to make a canoe in as a reparation for those two. Whether it's a true reparation, you can all decide that yourself. But.
What I love about this whole tale here is I feel like, the Lewis and Clark that we're all sort of familiar with and are taught is this sort of superhero like journey. And it's not to say their journey was not heroic, but there's also this sort of aspect of it being a comedy of errors. Like they keep losing their canoes. They're not prepared for the rain. They don't know how to deal with the elk meat. It's just like it seems like there's something that's very humanizing about that.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you go into this place, you don't know what the weather's like, and everything just kind of goes wrong for them.
Yeah. They were incredible planners, and they did the best they could. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what they were going to encounter. They made as many precautions as they can, from picking the people on the expedition. The guys they picked some had special skills, like they had a tailor, Joseph Whitehouse, knew how to tan hides. They were great. These were frontiersmen. They knew how to build carpentry. They tried to find the best folks they could, but there's only so much you can prepare for. And coming out here, they didn't know what the weather was going to be like. As soon as they were able to start hunting, and they started preserving their meat and get things built up, but things are going to go wrong. And they had a lot of help all along the way. They probably could not have done it without the help from the different nations and indigenous people that they met. And so you got to give kudos to that. But yeah, they didn't know what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems like a bit of a harrowing journey. There were a lot of different things going on, but their stop in the Pacific Northwest is definitely an interesting story. And now we have a park up there, right? So you can go and visit Fort Clatsop and learn a bit about the journey. Is that right?
Yes. So what we at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park, the heart of the park is their winter encampment site, which is Fort Clatsop. And it's a replica. We like to call it Fort Clatsop 3.0. The original one that they built basically rotted away. Go figure, all the rain. Mm-hmm. And then in 1955, a replica was built of the fort by the community. People from Astoria, Warrenton, and Seaside, Clatsop County, built the fort. And then they petitioned the Park Service to take it over, which occurred in 1958. And unfortunately, in 2005, the 1955 fort burned. And so when you come here, you're going to see the 2006 version. And it was done, that fort was built with the help of over 700 volunteers putting in time to peel the logs. And so it was another really incredible community effort to rebuild that fort. And that's our 3.0 that you're going to see. Coming in the wintertime, this time of year, it's great to see because you get that authentic Lewis and Clark weather. But most of our visitors do come in the summertime. And that's when we have also rangers down at the fort in costume, giving different demonstrations and talk and just answering questions about the Lewis and Clark expedition and what life was like for them. We also provide kayaking. We offer in the summertime kayaking tours on the little Lewis and Clark River. So you get a little taste. If you want to go out with a ranger, you can get a little taste of what it was like to come and see the fort from the water aspect. And of course, we have a great visitor center with a little museum and films, and a wonderful bookstore that you can get a quick souvenir. We also have over 13 miles of trails. So if you want to walk in the footsteps and through the ecosystems that the expedition experienced, you can come in. Bring your puppy. If you want to bring your dog with you, it has to be on a leash, but you can go on a nice hike through the woods.
It's a great stop. I love going into the replica, the fort replica, and seeing the tiny, tiny, cramped little quarters in there. I love hiking the Fort to Sea Trail, as you mentioned, from Fort Clatsop out to the ocean. It's a long hike, but it's a really, really great hike, as you mentioned, going through these different ecosystems, through the forest and down through some sort of like, sandy, more sparse forest out to the ocean itself. It's a really great hike. So it seems like this is a great spot to visit. Maybe this is, as you mentioned, this is a good time of year to go visit and get a sense of why they hated it. But it seems like any time of year is a good time to go and see what you all have going on down there.
Yep. We're open 9 to 5. The every day of the week except Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Christmas Eve. Other than that, and if there's a huge winter windstorm that comes in, we close things down because it's not a good idea to be out there hiking when trees are falling. So,
as Lewis and Clark discovered, Jill, well, thank you so much for coming on today. It's super interesting. I really appreciate all of the education here.
You're welcome.
All right, folks. Well, that will do it for us for today. Until next time, you can watch our videos on the Oregonians YouTube channel and view all of our travel and outdoors coverage on OregonLive.com/travel, as well as HereIsOregon.com.
Please leave us a rating or review if you enjoy the show. And if you want to support this podcast as well as our local journalism, please consider a subscription to Oregon Live. You can find details at OregonLive.com/subscribe. Also, if you're a fan of the show and you're interested in potentially sponsoring it, you can get in touch with our marketing people at advertise@oregonian.com. This episode of the show was produced by me alongside Jamie Hale, Teresa Mahoney, and Vicki Connor.
Stay safe and happy travels, everyone. Until next time, we leave you with this 10 seconds of Zen.